Hello and welcome to this Fane online event. I'm journalist Hepzhibah Anderson and it's a total pleasure to be here with the novelist Tess Gunty. Tess burst into print last year with her debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, and if you haven't read it, you must. You are in for a treat. It's set in a fictional town in America's Rust Belt and tells the story of a group of disparate residents who all live in a low-income housing community, and it's set over the course of a single, sweltering summer. It's funny, it's heartbreaking, it's endlessly inventive, and it's no surprise that it's won Tess prizes, plaudits, and now a TV deal. Tess, hi.
Hi.
That is, by any standards, a dream beginning to a literary career. I wonder, has it felt as wild a ride as it sounds?
Much wilder.
Really?
I think, yeah.
Do tell.
I think I have so many friends who are writers, and so I had very tempered, very, I think, realistic expectations going into literary fiction. The truth is that most books, even from major publishers, just don't get a lot of attention. So this was, to say that it exceeded my expectations is such an understatement.
This is publishing is slow.
Yes.
When did you finish the novel, I wonder?
Let's see. I guess I worked on it for about 5 years before submitting it to an agent.
Yeah.
And then I worked for about a year with an editor on it. And then, So I guess I finished it August of, 2021, I think. Yeah, 2022. It was published in August 2022.
Do you remember where you were when you heard that it had sold?
Yes, I do. Well, the biggest news was that, I had submitted it to my agent, and she and I were going to work on revisions together. And so I was just waiting for her notes. And Andrew, my partner, and I went on this road trip, and we were driving up the coast of California, and my agent said, "We need to talk." And she was very serious. And I thought, she's dropping me. Somehow she changed her mind. She doesn't want to represent me anymore. And
it's breakup talk, isn't it?
Yes, it was like all periods, no exclamation points. And then I was in I was in this little town called what was it called? Something, Carmel by the Sea. It's like this beautiful kind of vacation town in California, a little storybook town. And she called, and I was in the car, and she said, "So your book's sold," or "It's about to sell," or, so this editor's reading it, he wants to preempt it. He still needs permission from the higher ups, but I have to ask you now if it's okay if he lets other people read it. So I was, I think that the news had this very dream-like quality, specifically because I was in Northern California, sort of by the sea, and in this beautiful, dreamy environment when I got the news. And then, a few days later, I learned it had officially been someone made an offer. Yeah. And
then I suppose it just gathered momentum, and you've had a crazy year and a half, I suppose, 2 years.
Yes. So, ever since then, really since that moment, it has just been, hit the ground running.
Yeah. 5 years sounds a long time. It's not overly long in the scheme of literary fiction, I know.
Yeah.
You were very young, am I right in thinking? You clearly are still very young, but did you begin it while you were still studying for your MFA?
Yes, I was 22, I think, when I began the novel. And a lot of it, I have to say, like, all the foundation was written very quickly. I think that often happens where all the characters, the sort of the main movement of the story, and the kind of all of the atmospheres, the color palettes, everything came to me when I was 23, this one summer. And then it takes 5 years. It took me 5 years to refine it, to develop it, to figure out what was, how to structure it more efficiently and more coherently without compromising any of the kind of, productive chaos that I was trying to cultivate. But yeah, I think that for first-time novels, often it takes so long because, for me at least, I was so young when I began it that I was changing very rapidly as a writer.
I was going to say, it must have changed considerably, but also you as a person, and yes, definitely as a writer.
Definitely, and I had started a few other projects that, I'd probably written 500 pages of other projects by the time I got to this one, all of which I thought it would be a novel, something that I would that I would eventually submit to people. But I think that this one was the one that lived on and kind of didn't leave me alone because it was so capacious, and so it was allowed to grow with me. And I felt that it was it kind of invited a certain variousness and maturity that I don't think the other projects did invite. And maybe that also had to do with the fact that so many of the characters in this book are very superficially different from me. And so I was able to access them. Whereas if I had been writing a character that was too much like myself, I think that would have died very quickly in changing so much.
I suppose there is a personal dimension in that it's set in the Midwest.
Yes.
You grew up in South Bend, Indiana.
Yes.
Vacca Vale, fabulously creative place. I loved at one point somebody had said, oh, you have to read Dante's Inferno, at least Purgatorio, because it's like a travel guide. It's Vacca Vale. But I wondered how consciously you were drawing on your own experience of that particular somewhat overlooked, it's the flyover states on you, that part of America.
Right.
And as a follow-up question, whether you felt you could have written it had you stayed in Indiana, or whether you had to move away to get the necessary perspective.
Yes, I mean, I'll answer the second question first, which is I definitely needed to leave it in order to write about it. I'd been writing fiction ever since I was very little, and I'd never set anything in a town like mine. And partly it was because I'd absorbed this message that stories didn't happen in the post-industrial Midwest in towns like mine. I had never read anything or really watched anything that was set there, and that's not to say that those books don't exist, but they weren't reaching me. And so I think it took me a long time to understand the danger of that particular message. I think when you internalize that your life, the stories happening within and around you, are not worthy of attention, of other people's attention, of your own attention, you also become divested of kind of creative and political will. And so I think this is one reason why all forms of representation really matter in art. And when I moved to New York, this was the first time I'd lived outside of my hometown. And I lived there for about a year when I started writing this book. And I noticed that all of my writing was drawn back to this place. Even if I tried to set it in New York or in even a dystopian, vision of the future, it would always be pulled back to my home. And so I thought, I need to address this. I need to interrogate this. Why am I drawn to this? And what is it that I feel compelled to say? And really, in the beginning, it was this purgatorial sensation that I had in my hometown, but also in towns that had very similar histories to mine in that region, which is called the Rust Belt in the United States. It's a region of America that is derided as flyover country and often dismissed, but it was known for its kind of manufacturing, which mostly abruptly closed in the 60s when companies decided to outsource labor. And a lot of these towns were left completely abandoned and essentially orphaned by their economies. And really since the 60s, nothing has arrived to fill the economic shoes that were vacated. So I had this sensation in my town and in these towns immediately. It was so powerful. It was just like a temperature drop or something. As soon as I stepped in there, that I was in this waiting room of life, that we were in a kind of small windowless waiting room with beige furniture, and no one was at the desk, and you didn't know when you were going to be called. And that sensation, I find, produces such extreme behaviors in people, and it reveals kind of pre-existing vulnerabilities, pre-existing desperations. There's something about that atmosphere that kind of draws out a lot of crises that I consider distinctly American, but also global. So that was the beginning.
Oh, see, that's wonderfully put. I mean, your characters are, by necessity, they not only is that their hometown, that's the scenario in which they've grown up, they also are in this low-income housing complex. So the pressures on them are ultra intense. And then you've got this insanely hot summer. And they each find their own way of expressing these anxieties. And they're wonderfully individual and creative and rich in a surprising way. And each of these characters just seems so vivid and so real. I wonder which of the characters came to you first. You say it all came over the course of a summer for you.
Yes. Joan came to me first.
Did she?
Joan is a middle-aged woman who moderates comments on an obituary website for a living. And she, I think that really the entire novel was sort of ordained by Joan. I think that when she came into the scene, she determined everything about the tone, the atmosphere, the humor, the sort of contrast between the sublime and the mundane, which I'm always drawn to when I'm reading. So I think her job was my entry point into the atmosphere of this place, because I'd heard an interview with someone who does this for a living, who screens obituary comments for foul language and copyrighted material.
It's so niche.
Yes, and yet it was. I could not stop thinking about what that job would do to your imagination, to your experience of reality, and you sort of between these two realms, which is the supremely mundane world of the internet, and then the afterlife, grieving, mourning, loss, and so. I was interested in that kind of contrast.
It's there are so many different dimensions to this particular world that you've created. There's a lot of supernatural stuff in there, religion as well, spirituality features, which is something you don't encounter that frequently in contemporary literature. I wondered if you could talk about the religious aspects, actually, because I think Joan is sort of a believer, and there's a lot of Catholic imagery and discourse as well. And of course, the main character, I think probably for a lot of readers, will be Blandine, who is this mesmerizing, strange, sort of ethereally beautiful teenage girl who's aged out of the foster system. And her coping mechanism, one of them is to immerse herself in the life of this medieval mystic called Hildegard of Bingen, and I'm not sure many people necessarily have come across her before. So yes, I wondered if you could talk about how that all found its way in.
Yes, I mean, from the beginning, I wanted to create an environment that was, one of the reasons I set it in a fictional town was because, of course, I wanted to pull from all of these cities in the Rust Belt, but also because I wanted there to be a slightly mythical, unstable quality about this place. I'm always drawn to things that have a kind of glint of the otherworldly, things that don't feel necessarily set in, a place that, I guess I'm drawn to things where everything that happens could happen in our world, but it probably wouldn't. And for me, I suppose the religious dimension was kind of an effort at both realism and at supernatural, because in my town is extremely Catholic. South Bend, Indiana is extremely Catholic. There's a Catholic university there, and my family was extremely Catholic, and so I grew up only in Catholic schools, attending church twice a week. My mother's version of Catholicism, the one that she kind of practices, is extremely supernatural. It's very invested in the mystical and signs and wonders and visions and prophecies. And she is always reading about the lives of the saints. And specifically, she has a kind of devotion to the Virgin Mary. And so I think that this element of life was sort of the air I breathed for so much of my childhood, especially. And one thing that I no longer identify as Catholic, but one thing that I found so compelling about it, specifically my mother's version, was that it was this portal into another world. It kind of was this bridge into a place where everything was possible, and it was really indistinguishable from magic and witchcraft and everything else I was drawn to at that time. So this town, this fictional town, is also very Catholic. I think of Joan as a kind of run-of-the-mill Catholic. She was raised Catholic, she practices it, but isn't quite isn't deeply engaged with it every day. Whereas Blandine was not raised with any kind of religion, but she becomes very invested in the lives of these medieval female Catholic mystics, and specifically Hildegard von Bingen. And one thing that drew me to Hildegard, I had also not encountered her until I was researching for this book, but I'd encountered many other women of the church who are sort of known for their mystical writings or visions. And I was named after Thérèse de Lisieux, and so there were lots of other people that I knew of growing up. But Hildegard distinguished herself by being so intellectually confident. And obviously she was born in 1098 in Germany. This was not a given for women. There was no access to education or, any kind of platform where they would be trusted, consulted. And yet she was consulted by kings. She was certainly trusted by the clergy at the time. And I think that in part had to do with her extraordinary confidence in her mind. And so she invented a language. She was a true polymath. She wrote medical texts, along with her theology, philosophy, and of course her mystical writings. And I think what is most compelling to Blandine about her is that Blandine doesn't really see a way out of her life. She longs very, very, I think, in a kind of animal way to leave the cage of her body. She's been targeted all her life, and made to feel kind of unwelcome in her body, in her town. And she doesn't have any money. She doesn't, she didn't even finish high school. She doesn't have any connections or family. But in Hildegard, she sees this form of escape, not only in the kind of divine ecstasy that she describes, but also in Hildegard's intellectual pursuits. Blandine sees this form of escape where you can just retreat to your mind, and all you need is kind of books and time and quiet. And those are things that she can imagine procuring for herself. So she really sees Hildegard as this kind of a role model and almost like an intellectual companion.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you get these sort of little mini trends in literary fiction, and I feel like 2 or 3 novels, which makes a trend,
yes,
have landed on my desk in the past sort of 6 months, subsequent to yours, that have been medieval in focus. There was a debut novel that came out here. I don't know if it's published in the States, and it twins the lives of 2 real female mystics. And then there's another, Benjamin Myers just had a novel out called Cuddy, which starts off in the medieval Northern England. And I wonder, there's a constant anxiety among your characters that seems born of life in the digital realm as to what is real and what is reality, what is life, and what is authentic. And I don't know if there's a question here, but I wonder if somehow that feeds into this medieval curiosity.
Yes, I think that's a really compelling reason or explanation for it. I've noticed this as well. I mean, there was even a profile in the New Yorker of Hildegard von Bingen very recently, and I'd never seen anything about her before. But I mean, in kind of mainstream journalism. But I think you're right. I think it has to do with this kind of disembodied world that we live in right now. And I think also it's a kind of response to, I know misogyny is certainly not new, but I think any time that bodily rights are under attack, or women are under attack, I think specifically in America, when Trump was elected, when he won against the first female viable presidential candidate, and he really embodied all of the misogyny that all of the worst sort of misogyny, the most cartoonish version of it that you can imagine. I think that a lot of women started to feel that progress that had been made was starting to be reversed, or that it was maybe a bit of a delusion. And obviously now with reproductive rights under attack in the United States, there's even more of a kind of a Handmaid's Tale sort of reaction to contemporary politics. And I think that we always look for sort of models of people who have defied the misogyny of their contexts to guide us in times of crisis. I think that has something to do with it too, but I think you're right that the internet has a lot to do with it.
I mean, Blandine, it's interesting that you mentioned misogyny, because Blandine is sort of ethereally beautiful, and which makes her very vulnerable, and you fear from her, and her fate is what stokes the anxiety. There's a sort of ticking clock to the narrative, isn't there? That you get the sense right at the beginning, no spoiler alerts needed, that she is imperiled. And her beauty somehow makes her even more vulnerable. But at the same time, she's it's spooky, it's extraterrestrial, all these are words used of it, and it unnerves people, which makes it quite powerful.
Yes, I think that was kind of, it was almost a kind of craft tool to create a character who was so magnetic to people for various reasons, you know, not only people who were attracted to her, but I guess the types of attraction are really varied in this book. And people feel, yes, unnerved by her. She also is socially kind of strange. Her mode of interaction is usually by relaying facts or information. And I think it was a time of my life where I was feeling really frustrated by mythologies of beauty. I think that growing up, you know, most girls are fed this tale that that beauty is the most powerful currency that you can possess, and that nothing else you do in life, you know, can really compare to the mobility that beauty will grant you, conventional beauty will grant you. And of course, we're fed this through folk tales, through advertisements, through social experiences. And I think that Blandine was almost kind of a wish fulfillment. She was someone who was offered that currency through no effort of her own. And yet she intuitively rejects it. She understands that if it is a currency at all, it's a false currency, and it's like all currencies, which is it's a kind of widely agreed upon fiction to prop up existing power structures. And she knows that the attention that it gets her is not, doesn't make her free. The kind of attention that it gets her is usually requires her to give something of herself to other people that she doesn't want to give. And then when she doesn't, she's punished. So I think so many women experience that kind of realization at some point. And yet, I guess in Blandine, it was nice to stage this conversation in a mind that was so clear. I think for myself personally, I never had that kind of clarity. It was always something that I still wanted to be, you know, when I was growing up. But she just rejects it.
Yeah. The other thing that gives it real contemporary resonance is that and stokes that anxiety in a very subtle way is climate concerns. And it's an unnaturally hot summer, that particular summer. And it's one of Blandine's great campaigns as well. I mean, that she really directs her energies towards. And I mean, I think, you know, a few years ago, there was a lot of buzz about Cli-Fi, you know, it had a name, it was a thing. But do you think, could you envisage ever writing a novel without that in it now? I mean, do you think it's such a part of our awareness? And is it your responsibility as a novelist to just nudge people's awareness of that and remind us it's a threat? Yes, I mean, I find it was kind of surprising to me that the climate crisis was appearing in this book. It wasn't something that I intended to do. But I do think that anytime you're just paying attention to your surroundings, you will inevitably be led to all of the existing crises that are, even if you're setting something in a different time period, I think that the social concerns of your time will influence the way that you look back on that time period. And for me, I mean, there are two floods in this book, in this fictional town, that happened back to back, two historic floods, and those were modeled on real floods that happened in my town. Obviously, there's extreme drought and, you know, all sorts of weather patterns all over America and all over the world right now that are unprecedented. And I worked as a research assistant on a book of nonfiction about the climate crisis and industrial farming a few years ago. And so for 2 years, I was very immersed in this research. And yet I found that the information had this tendency to not really produce an emotional reaction that was commensurate with the crisis. And so that became a part of the book. The author I was working with wanted to interrogate that specific problem. And of course, we all know that our brains evolved to perceive threats that are immediate and close and very acute. And this is such a grand, all-encompassing, you know, at times abstract kind of crisis that our brains are simply not programmed to understand them. And yet, in this book, the way that it manifests
it is acute. I mean, in our actual daily lives, the way that the climate crisis rears its head, it always has acute sort of consequences for those around you and for yourself. So I do think, especially I now live in California, and the wildfires, I was there for the worst wildfire season on record. Last time I was in London, it was a historic heat wave here as well. And I think no matter where you live, it's inescapable.
We should also say this is a very funny book.
There's always a point in the interview.
Don't worry, yes,
funny.
By the way, it's really funny.
Yeah.
Was the humour in there from the very start? Were you aware of the being a scale, and you've got the darkness and the light? I mean, it is funny, but actually it's very, very serious, a lot of the humour as well. So it's actually light, but it's
I do find that this particular the humor of this book really did assert itself immediately, and it was an extremely important part of the atmosphere of the book. I was reading a lot of Joy Williams at the time, and also Anne Carson, and both of them they're very different writers, but I think their senses of humor are were instructive to me. And the kind of humor I'm most drawn to is it has the same effect as the uncanny. It sort of takes something familiar and alters it a few degrees. Just yesterday, I was playing around with a kind of AI image generator. You can give it prompts. Of course, you've seen these. And I find this to be, it was a perfect example of how similar humor and the uncanny, like they're just just minor degrees of difference. Because sometimes it would produce something very, very funny, and other times it was absolutely terrifying. And usually it was produced by the same phenomenon, which is this slight unfamiliarity. And anytime that you encounter humor or the uncanny, it makes you see something very differently. It makes you see something new. And I suppose defamiliarization is important to me when I write. I try to let that guide my descriptions of the environment. And I'm trying to surprise myself first and foremost, because if you don't do that, then you're certainly not going to surprise the reader.
The characterization is so deftly done, and often there's a series of lists in the book, and characters often emerge from these lists, and in those lists you'll find really quirky juxtapositions. So I think I remember Joan at one point, she's summed up in, I think, 3 traits. So she reads a lot of Dickens. She has an unnatural capacity for consuming vast amounts of watermelon in one sitting. And I think there was one other trait. She's never crossed a crosswalk with confidence. Yes. And actually there was a 4th, wasn't there? She's very mistrustful of people who claim not to like bread.
Yes.
And I just think it's so funny, but it's also, you see her just like that.
I think that when I'm getting to know someone, those are the things I'm always drawn to. I always want to know about the aberrations, the things that make them sort of apart from whatever demographic of kind of shorthand about people that they've been pushed into. And that's when that person becomes very vivid. And these characters, they are very quirky and peculiar, but I find that people I meet in real life are that way all the time. I mean, I just met someone who's like, collects human skulls for fun, and he's just a bookseller, and yet people, I met another woman recently who likes to make taxidermy out of roadkill she finds. I find that these are the entry points into that person's personality, and really, I think that you can kind of create a very vivid character by attending to those qualities first.
Yeah. When you were creating the characters, did those qualities present themselves up front, or did you have to get to know the characters a bit more to extract those qualities?
I think that they all presented themselves very quickly. They were the things that taught me how to describe, who this person was and how to go forward with them. Yeah. I do think that, when I'm writing, I tend to try to cut off any kind of shorthand I have about people, about just environments or descriptions. And so, these kinds of descriptions are usually helpful when I'm trying to get to know someone.
Do you keep notebooks? Are you a scribbler, longhand scribbler?
I do, yes. Although I am very disorganized, so they have several. I'm not someone who's gonna, if anyone tried to read them, it would make no sense at all. And a lot of it is just to-do lists or maths that I'm trying to do. Yeah. But I also take notes on my phone too. I do think that whatever it is, I do need to be receptive throughout the day to any kind of idea, and you can always tell when the writing is going well, because throughout your day, you will see so many things that just seem to have emerged directly from your novel. Or you'll just be walking and get an idea. And that still actually happens to me with this book. I will be walking and an idea will come for dialogue or a description, and I have
that would fit inside this novel,
yes,
even though it's long
it's
done and dusted.
Yeah, but I still write them down, and who knows if they'll make their way into something.
Does it feel like the characters are still with you, some of them?
Yes,
Any of them?
I think so. I'm not someone who, I think I used to. I know
you're back into the realm of the supernatural here.
Yes. I mean, I do think it's, when I was younger, I really felt that the characters I was writing, I know it's absurd for a 30-year-old to reference when she was younger, but I think when I was a child and a teenager, when I was writing, I felt that the characters were so real. I felt that they were my friends, or at least people that I could encounter in the real world. And I think as I grew up, I became suspicious of that kind of relationship with your characters. I do think that sometimes that emerges when you are drawing from a reservoir of shorthand about people. And I think I noticed that often when I or someone else would try to describe someone they knew really well, or a character that was really complex and full of contradictions, other people would often say, I just can't see this person. I don't understand. There's nothing for me to hold on to. So I do think that kind of, in a strange way, the more simplified and sort of cartoonish a character is, the more there's a kind of immediate recognition. People can say, oh, I can put that character into a box in my head, and I know what they look like, and I know what kind of car they drive, and I know what they like to eat. And I think good fiction disrupts that, disrupts those assumptions. But it is true that I think when you spend 5, now 6, going on 7 years with certain people, and when you're talking about them all the time, certain people do stay with me. Joan stays with me. Blandine stays with me. Moses stays with me. Yeah.
Have you been surprised at all by the reception among readers to certain characters or to the place? How's it gone down back home?
Yes. I think the fact that anyone's reading it at all is still a surprise to me. So any kind of reaction is usually is very surreal. But one thing that I found really encouraging was that my early drafts of this, I was giving it to friends or to mentors, and a lot of people would read Blandine and say, I just don't believe that a young woman could be like this. And I never understood what they meant by that. And I never really understood what they were reacting to. I mean, I started writing her when I was 22. She's 18. And I felt very close to her. And so I felt that, she was very different from me on so many levels, but I did feel that her kind of interior life was very similar to mine. And so that was one piece of advice that I always had to ignore. And now I just did an event with at a college campus, and I was meeting a lot of young people who had read the novel, and a lot of young women came up to me and said, I am Blandine, this is me. And that was really gratifying. I felt like I wrote her because I felt that there was this kind of missing, I had never seen this kind of person represented in fiction, this kind of young woman. I felt that young women especially were just always boxed into certain kinds of types. And I wanted to write someone who was resisting all of those types, who was unpredictable, who was really defining herself by her intelligence, her curiosity, her activism, and not the things that her town was kind of telling her to derive value from.
What did you find most challenging, taking you back to the drafting process? It sounds like the characters came pretty quickly. Yes. The place you had.
Yeah, I think it was confidence, actually. I think when I was young, it's great, but when I started, first of all, I'd never had anything that had lasted for 5 years. I'd never been in a school for 5 years. I'd never lived anywhere. I mean, I lived in my hometown, but as an adult, as an adult, I'd never had a relationship for 5 years at that point. So it was the longest relationship that I'd ever had with a piece of work, or even just a kind of psychological space. And I think that it's a really common experience that when you're young, you're a writer, you're submitting short stories, you're trying to get other projects off the ground, and you just face so much rejection. It's inevitable. But at that time of my life, I was really terminally insecure. I was so willing to believe that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't, that I wasn't cut out for this work, even though it was what I was most drawn to and it was the only thing I felt I wanted to do. I think that the rejections, I internalized them so deeply, and it was really fighting those that was the most difficult aspect of this whole process. And really, when I finished the novel, my confidence was so low. Other things I'd written had been rejected. And usually on the basis of it being too strange. Everyone was saying, oh, publishing's very risk averse, and you're a first time author, you can't write anything that's too strange, or, you have to play it safe. And so when I finished this book, I did it only because I needed to find closure on it.
Yeah.
And I put it on my shelf, I bound it really nicely, and I wasn't going to submit it to anyone. You always hear that you only have one chance with each agent, and I didn't want to mess it up. And it was really months later, after I was trying and failing to write something safe and normal, that my friend encouraged me to submit this. So yes, I think it was just confidence that was the hardest part.
And what kept you going was just the need to move on and do something else.
I think,
was there some other flicker of?
I think it was. I think it was such a. I guess when I was little, I wrote. Not to publish, of course. I wrote because I was just drawn to it. And that was kind of what powered me through this book, too. It was, I suppose I've made peace with the idea that not everything I've ever written is going to find readers or be published. But there is some other relationship with the process that I find electrifying and magnetic. And it's where I feel most alive when it's going well. And so I think kind of learning to write truly for my own sort of my own life, my own enrichment, my own sense of purpose is the thing that kept me going on this.
I wonder if it's hard to sustain that, weirdly, having had all this success, because now people are waiting.
Yes, I mean, I've never written anything knowing it would be read or published, but this was this was a 2-book deal, and so I have to submit the next one soon. Yeah. Good. Yeah, but I think it definitely requires a shift, and I think there are benefits and there are perils to any version of this. I think after a first novel, if it does really poorly, then your confidence is shaken. If it does really well, then you feel like an imposter, and then it can be intimidating to approach your work again. But I do try as hard as I can to simply shut out those noises and to write as though it won't be published, as though, the way I wrote this, which is just kind of an imaginary reader who's smarter than I am and more interesting than I am, and whose inner life I'm collaborating with. And just that one kind of person. There's a Kurt Vonnegut quote I like, which is something like, if you write to please just one person, if you open all the doors and windows of your story to the world, your story will get pneumonia. And I think that's what I'm trying to keep in mind now.
Do you have a routine at all, and has that changed?
I think, I've been traveling.
While you're on the road with this, it's tricky to...
when I'm traveling, the truth is that I'm kind of just in survival mode. Yes. I don't really have it. When you're traveling for this kind of work, it's so, and if you're an introvert, and if it's quite overwhelming to me. But when I'm home, when I'm in a regular routine, I guess I have a series of things that I do, and I can kind of do them in any order, but I do need to do them all in order to write, which is you need to go for a very long walk, preferably in a natural space. I need to read quite a lot of poetry usually, but fiction tends to not inspire me the way that poetry does. Poetry's like this little shot of espresso for my brain when I'm writing. And then I need to have quiet, or at least a place where I can, put on headphones of nature sounds or something. But I tend to write best when all of those 3 things can happen.
Can I ask if you're working on something currently? I mean, I know I can ask. Will you tell me?
I am working. I have about 100 pages of the next novel drafted. I'm envisioning it as kind of divided into three parts. And I have this impulse to talk about it, but I'm trying a new thing where I don't talk about it before it's written. Yeah.
And do you have first readers? Have you got a group of writer friends that you chat with? Or is it just very much you and the text until it's ready to go out into the world?
I feel lucky. I do have a lot of people I mean, Andrew, I mentioned before, he reads the book. He reads whatever I write almost as soon as I write it. And he's not a writer. He's an urban designer and an architect. And so I think he's very supportive. And his voice is always one of just kind of encouragement. And then I think when something's more refined, I'll give it to some friends that are also writers. And I feel lucky that now, with the kind of digital resources we have, I can be in contact with a lot of friends who don't live in the same city I live in. And then we exchange work, and I think it's very, there's a lot of cross-pollination, and it's very generative to exchange work with people who you respect. Yeah.
You did graduate from an MFA program, which
yes,
it's rare to find, certainly an American novelist debuting who hasn't got that behind them. But I think it's certainly still not the norm, not quite the norm over here in the UK. Could you have envisaged publishing, becoming a writer without going through a postgraduate study?
I think unfortunately now, I mean, I think there are some realities now that are just hard to contend with as a young artist, or someone's trying to make art, which is that cost of living in major cities is so high that this world of sort of like just wandering Paris and writing short stories here and there, like walking around town all day, that doesn't exist anymore. And yet, of course, you don't have to live in a major city, but even smaller places, the cost of living is so intense, and so many people graduate with extreme debt, in America. So for me, this was this miraculous. We also don't have healthcare, so it's like unless you have a full-time salaried job. So for me, this program was this miraculous opportunity to simply live the life that artists have always lived, which is congregating in groups of other people, spending all your time exchanging work and exchanging ideas, thinking, reading, working, and being in a city that was very, vibrant and influential for me. It was New York. And so it was this kind of, I had health insurance, I had a stipend, for a living stipend. It was a funded program. So I never imagined that I would have that opportunity at such a young age to work with my heroes, to just write. And that was a really like an insane kind of privilege. And I think maybe there are misconceptions. I've been in other countries where MFAs are not so normal, where or common, that everyone's going to an MFA to sort of conform to one model.
Factory.
Kind of puppy mill for books. And I didn't find that to be the case. I think that there are maybe some programs where that is true, but for me, all the faculty was really different. All the students were really different. And that kind of diversity was really celebrated. Yeah.
What else inspires you when you've mentioned the daily walk, poetry?
Yeah. I think research inspires me, but I don't do it very efficiently or even with a kind of end game in mind. Often if something interests me, I'll try to learn about it. And, very often it doesn't make it into the work, but I think it does keep my brain alive, and it kind of keeps the ecosystem of my thoughts healthy. And so that helps a lot. I think traveling helps, being in a new environment, or returning to an old environment that I left. And obviously, other people help, just talking not only to other writers, which I do find incredibly comforting and wonderful, but also people who work in completely different jobs who have a lot to teach me about worlds that I don't know anything about. And even just, I used to work at a bakery when I was in high school, and we had a stand at a farmer's market, and people would come up to me. This kind of market created a very communal environment. People would come up and just talk to me about their lives for hours. Very typically it was someone, older, who had been kind of left behind, and maybe they were feeling lonely. And I found that even though none of their stories are replicated in this book or really any of my writing, it's something about simply absorbing other people's lives, other people's narratives, and immersing yourself in the concerns, the desires, the fears of other people. That always, not only helps the writing, it just helps me feel more alive and more connected to the people around me.
It does sound like you were always going to be a novelist, the way you described that. Were you a scribbler? You mentioned writing in childhood.
Yes.
Were you an early reader? Did you publish your own little books as a child?
I mean,
typing them up?
I was really, I was really drawn to it from even before I knew how to spell. I would, my mom was an art teacher. We were always very encouraged to make art in my house. And my dad was a sociologist and he loved to read. And we were at the library all the time. And I think because my family didn't have much in the way of kind of disposable income to spend on camps or private lessons or, all these other kinds of external structures, my parents really encouraged us to be, me and my 3 older brothers, to be the guides of our own creative exploration and to sort of, all my brothers are really creative. They're musicians and visual artists and readers and writers. And I think that growing up in a household where creativity was an end in and of itself rather than a means to an end, I mean, I really don't, of course, later in life I imagined publishing, but for so much of my life, all of the things I loved, I just did them because I loved them. Singing, theater, drawing. I did a ton of visual art when I was little and through college. And so I think that I'm so grateful for that environment that totally separated the creative act from any kind of monetary or market value. And yeah, it didn't occur to me really until college that I could pursue writing in any kind of formal way.
Now that you are very formally pursuing it, what has been the most bizarre or unexpected aspect of being in print, being on the road, being reviewed? I mean,
I have to say that just all the positivity has been the most surprising aspect. I know that there's also negativity. It's not like a perfect, and I get, I disabled I had this thing on my website where people could email me directly, and I don't do that anymore.
Oh no, really?
Not always great. It was 99% of the time it was wonderful, and it's just lovely readers, and then 1%. And I also deactivated my social media kind of for similar reasons. But I do think that it has been, I think I talked about the rejections and this impression that I had of publishing being very risk averse before I entered it. And I found that that's not true at all. I found that, not just my book, but all the other books around me that I see celebrated are ones that are really taking risks in lots of different ways. And I find that readers are really receptive to books that are unapologetically themselves and that are doing new things, or nothing's exactly new, but things that haven't been in the mainstream in our lifetime. And I've also found that book selling is this incredibly hopeful, all the booksellers I've encountered have really championed work that they believe in. Yeah. And I think I kind of thought that the entire industry was really, there were just things that had to get they were receiving a lot of marketing power from publishing houses, and so they sold. But really and that of course happens to some extent, but I've met so many booksellers who are guided by a true passion for their work and are willing to support books that are, not obvious, popular hits. And I think that the kind of, the other writers, the community of awards, the critics, it's amazing to me how alive this world is. We're often told that it's dying.
Yes.
And literature has no place in the world and no ability to shape
the
history.
Novel. Oh, wow.
Yes. And I think also the recent book bans in the United States evidence the power of literature. I mean, people are afraid of it because they know that it's transformative. And to me, although that is an incredibly dangerous and devastating development in a kind of American politics, it also evidences that literature has enduring power.
It's validating, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah.
How are you feeling about the transition to screen? I mean, that's...
Well, the thing is, it's just been optioned, and so I think only that means that, like 1%.
Negativity! We're going to... Few time. I was really surprised it actually got made. That was the biggest surprise.
Yes, I think that like really small percentage of things that get optioned get made. But it was surprising to me that anyone was even willing to take the risk on this novel, because I don't think it's an obvious adaptation. And there have been a lot of people who...
Yeah, although it is very sort of episodic, isn't it? And it's very... it's almost sort of stagey. You've got that single building, the hub, and all these different voices.
Yeah, I think...
And the stories weave themselves in a very... it would be for a series, presumably, rather than a...
Yes, I think that's what has been settled, But I think... yeah, it's just amazing to imagine. I have no desire at all to be in control of it or to write it or to do, you know, I'm an executive producer, which really just means I'm kind of a consultant. But I am excited to see what someone else's imagination does. I think that, you know, I really would love to see it completely in the hands of someone else to become their, you know, their creative gesture. And that would be, that's very exciting.
Yeah. What have you come across recently in terms of art, I suppose, novels, sure, but poetry, any other art form that has really excited you? You've mentioned lots of books that you feel were not obvious titles that publishers have been willing to take a risk on.
Yeah, I mean, there was a book I read when I was revising mine, a book of poems called A Sand Book by Ariana Reins. And it's a novel length book. I think there are several parts to the poetry. That book has really, I read it out loud to myself, every single poem as I was revising, and I loved her work. And there was a novel, If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. It's a small, you know, it's a kind of novella. That book I read recently, and it's so beautifully written. The author Noor Naga is a poet as well. Noor Al-Sadir is also a poet who wrote this poetry collection called Fourth Person Singular that I love. And then in terms of other things, I guess there was a visual artist I encountered in Los Angeles at a small gallery called Simpiwe Nzube, and he's from South Africa. I think he lives in Los Angeles, but he creates these very, I think he's kind of inspired by magical realism, and he creates these very joyful, very lively, very kind of frightening sometimes, but also very warm paintings and sculptures that are kind of mythological, and there are kind of hybrid human animal figures throughout, very bright colors. And that was the first exhibit I saw after museums opened again, you know, after vaccination, and that kind of made my brain come alive. Yeah, and I think, let's see, so much music actually recently that I've discovered too.
But you're not writing to music; you're writing to silence still.
Not usually, but sometimes I find that it varies a lot depending on how much concentration I have. Sometimes it can help a lot, but I can't ever listen to words when I'm writing. Yeah. So
what's on your playlist?
Oh, well, I actually made a playlist for the Rabbit Hutch. I think that the National Book Foundation has it on Spotify. So I think if you look up the Rabbit Hutch, Tess Gunty, National Book Foundation, you'll find it. But then this other, a student that I met at that college visit that I was just describing also made a playlist. And I think her name is Winter, and her playlist is also just called the Rabbit Hutch. And she introduced me to music that I'd never heard before. You know, it's like the typical experience of sort of encountering a young person. I've never heard of any of these musicians, but I love them all. And also I found that her playlist was such a cool experience to kind of hear how the book was reflected in this reader's imagination. All of the music I found to be like perfect for this novel. So and then I think there's a lot of musicians that I listen to that create sort of ambient music. And unfortunately, I feel like so many of them, I don't know how to pronounce their names, so I'm afraid of saying it right now. But maybe at one point I'll put out a playlist of all of those people too.
Oh, well, it's been so wonderful talking to you. We're going to leave people with a really long, fabulously meaty list of cultural material to consume, but to which should be added the Rabbit Hutch if anybody out there has not read it. And definitely read it before it gets to the screen, because it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching, everybody. And we should let you get back to work, because I want to read what comes next.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.